This time, you really sent us down a rabbit hole.
Uh-huh.
The Microsoft Zune.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
We dove deep into Sneha Mali's article, Microsoft Zune, the MP3 player that never stood a chance, from March 7th, 2025.
Right.
Really a fascinating look at why Microsoft's attempt to, take a bite out of Apple in the mid-2000s with their own MP3 player didn't really work out.
Didn't work out the way they wanted, no.
And I think it's a piece of tech history, maybe not everybody remembers, but it offers some valuable insights, as we'll see.
Absolutely. I mean, for those of us who remember that era, the iPod's dominance was almost like, it was the only game in town. And the Zune was kind of Microsoft's big play to disrupt that.
Yeah.
And as Molly's article lays out really meticulously, the reasons for its fade out aren't just like one or two missteps, but they really point to how complex the tech market is. And that's really what we want to unpack for you today.
Exactly. We want to get under the hood of why the Zune struggled to gain traction. Looking at everything from whether Microsoft really understood what consumers even wanted at that time, to the branding challenges they faced, the critical importance of a robust ecosystem, something Apple had clearly mastered, and, of course, the ever-present factor of timing.
Yep.
So, let's start, just like Molly's article does, right at the beginning with consumer demand. By the time the Zune arrived in 2006, the iPod was already deeply entrenched.
Oh, yeah, it was. You have to remember, the iPod launched back in 2001.
Wow, yeah.
So that's a 5-year head start. And it wasn't just about market presence. Apple had built a pretty significant lead in just, mind share, right? But even more crucially, as the article points out, they weren't just selling a device. They were selling a whole experience, right?
Yeah.
It was centered around iTunes.
It was. And that ecosystem piece, as you really dig into Molly's analysis, seems absolutely foundational to understanding the Zune's struggles, doesn't it?
I think it is, yeah.
Apple created this incredibly smooth process, Discover music, buy it on iTunes, organize your library, and then seamlessly sync it to your iPod.
Yeah.
It just worked.
Yeah.
And it was really user-friendly.
And that's where Microsoft kind of faced an uphill battle from the get-go.
Yeah.
As Molly details, their proprietary software, it just lacked that same level of integration, that intuitive, feel. And it wasn't just a matter of missing a feature or two. It was really the user experience from the start just wasn't as, as polished or straightforward as what iTunes offered. And, think about it. By 2006, many consumers had already invested a lot of time and money, frankly, building their digital music libraries within iTunes.
Yeah.
So to get people to switch, Microsoft needed to offer not just a comparable device, but a demonstrably better experience and an equally easy one.
Yeah.
Which, according to the article, they didn't quite pull off.
They didn't quite nail it. And here's where it gets even more interesting, when you consider the broader context that you've brought up. Molly's article also reminds us that around this time, the way people were consuming music was starting to change quite a bit. Smartphones were becoming more and more prevalent, and the idea of streaming music services was starting to, bubble up.
It's true.
So, in a way, the Zune was kind of entering the standalone MP3 player arena, just as the market itself was maybe starting to contract a little bit.
Yeah.
Almost like they missed the crest of the wave.
Yeah, that's a critical point about timing that Molly really emphasizes. The Zune wasn't just late to the MP3 player market. It was, like you said, coming in as people's needs and preferences were starting to shift.
Right.
They wanted more multifunctional devices.
Yeah.
The idea of carrying just one device for calls, internet, and music, that was becoming more and more appealing.
Right.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and dive into branding. Molly's piece really paints a stark contrast between Apple's success in this area and the challenges that Microsoft faced with the Zune. The iPod wasn't just a piece of technology, was it?
No, it wasn't.
It really evolved into this cultural phenomenon.
It did. And, Apple brilliantly positioned the iPod as more than just a way to listen to music. It became associated with, certain lifestyle choices, creativity, individuality, being cool,
Yeah.
and their ad campaigns, those iconic silhouette commercials.
Oh, yeah.
The vibrant colors, the music,
Yeah.
it really cut through the noise and resonated with, especially younger demographics.
Yeah.
It's like the iPod became this desirable object,
And those ads were everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And instantly recognizable. So thinking about what you just said, what aspects of the Zune's branding as Molly presents them do you think really contributed to its struggles in comparison? Well, according to Molly's analysis, Microsoft, I think, struggled to create that same kind of aspirational compelling identity for the Zune.
Mhm.
Their marketing efforts seem to focus more on the technical specs, the features of the device, rather than telling a story about how the Zune fit into your life.
Yeah.
It was more like, here's a functional piece of technology, and in a market that's already saturated with tech products, that wasn't enough to capture people's imaginations the way Apple did.
Right. And even the name itself, Zune, and
Yeah.
Molly touches on this too,
Yeah.
it lacked that same kind of effortless appeal as, iPod.
Right.
It was simple, almost intuitive.
Yeah.
Zune just felt like, a
Right.
product name.
Right, it didn't have that cultural weight or that catchy quality.
Right, right.
Apple's branding tapped into an emotional connection with music and personal expression, whereas the Zune felt more like a direct competitor in a, feature-by-feature kind of way,
Mhm.
but it just didn't have that same emotional resonance.
Yeah. It didn't tell a story. Now let's circle back to this whole idea of the ecosystem, because Molly's article really underscores how important this was to the iPod's dominance and really the Zune's vulnerability. It wasn't just about the player itself, was it?
No, not at all. The iPod and iTunes were joined at the hip.
Yeah.
iTunes provided this huge, well-organized storefront and library.
Right.
It made it incredibly easy for users to, discover, buy, manage their music, and then transfer it to their iPod. It
Yeah.
was a complete package, really.
And the Zune marketplace, as Molly details, just couldn't compete on that same scale, right?
Right. It didn't have the same depth or breadth of content
Right.
that iTunes had built up over the years. So the selection wasn't there, which was a huge drawback for potential users. Plus, Microsoft really pushed a subscription-based model early on with the Zune Pass.
Right.
Essentially an all-you-can-eat music service, while iTunes was more focused on letting people buy and own individual tracks.
Yep.
And for a lot of people back then, that sense of ownership was a big deal.
I remember that.
Yeah.
You know?
Like, the subscription model was some people were hesitant about it.
Mm-hmm.
And Molly also points out this fundamental incompatibility between Zune devices and iTunes libraries.
Right.
That just seems like a huge barrier for anyone who was already invested in Apple's world.
It was. I mean, you'd have to rebuild your entire music collection from scratch.
Yeah.
And without a clear advantage to make up for that hassle and no easy way to move their existing libraries over, most people just stayed with iTunes.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about how Microsoft might have missed the mark on what consumers wanted, the branding challenges, the lack of a comparable ecosystem. Let's dig deeper into timing. Molly clearly says the Zune was late to the market, but how late was it really, and what were the impacts of that?
Well, as we said, the iPod had a 5-year head start. By the time the Zune came out in 2006, Apple wasn't just offering the original iPod anymore.
They had, they had the Nano, which was all about portability, and the iPod Touch, which was more interactive, almost like an early app device.
Right.
So the Zune was coming into a market where the leader already had a diverse lineup catering to different needs and price points.
And then, of course, as Molly reminds us, there's the iPhone in 2007,
Right.
just a year after the Zune.
It was a game changer.
A game changer. It really reshaped the whole mobile landscape, right?
It did. The iPhone was the beginning of the converged device era.
Yeah.
Why carry a separate MP3 player when your phone could do that and a bunch of other things? And, Apple, to their credit, adapted.
Right.
They kept innovating with the iPod Touch, which started to blur the lines with the smartphone. But Microsoft, initially, they kept focusing on the Zune as the standalone music player.
Interesting.
You
Molly's article also mentions the speed of product evolution. She notes that Microsoft's updates to the Zune were much slower compared to Apple's constant refinements and updates to the iPod. And in the tech world, that kind of lag can be, well,
It's a killer.
it can be a killer.
Technology moves so fast.
Yeah.
If you're not constantly refining your product, adding new features, listening to feedback, you're going to fall behind. Apple was always updating the iPod, keeping it fresh, desirable, and adding the things people wanted. The Zune's slower pace made it even harder to catch up.
So looking back at the Zune, what are the big lessons that businesses, especially in tech, can learn from its failure based on Molly's analysis?
Molly highlights some really important lessons. First, understanding consumer behavior and the power of ecosystems. If you're trying to break into a market with a dominant player, you need to offer something way better.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not just about having similar features. You need to offer a better experience or meet a need in a different way.
Exactly. Second, Branding is key, building that emotional connection. It's
Right.
not enough to just have good tech. You need a story that resonates with people, something they connect with.
And third, the ecosystem approach, right?
Absolutely. It's the whole journey from finding and buying content to how it works with the device.
Yeah.
And then, of course, timing. Entering a market too late, especially when big changes are happening.
Right.
You need to be aware of trends and where things are going.
And the need to always be innovating.
Right. Absolutely. The tech world never stands still. You have to
Yeah.
constantly improve, add features, and adapt to what people want.
Right. The Zune is a good reminder of these principles. Now, there's this interesting fast fact in Molly's article that I wanted to bring up. It says that despite not being very successful overall, the Zune had a small but loyal following. People loved its high-quality audio.
Interesting, right.
It suggests that they got something right, at least with the technology.
It does. It shows that the Zune had strengths in its design and technology. And what's even more interesting is what Molly says about some of its features, like the Zune Pass, the subscription service, being ahead of their time.
Right.
Looking back, it was kind of a preview of what we have now with Spotify and streaming services.
So, in a way, the Zune, even though it didn't win, had some forward-thinking ideas.
Exactly. It just shows that even in something that's considered a failure, there can be valuable lessons and hints of future trends.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into the Microsoft Zune, all thanks to Sneha Molly's fantastic article.
It really has.
As you can see, it's a great case study of how the tech market works and all the things that contribute to a product's success or failure.
It is. And like we've talked about, even though the Zune didn't become what Microsoft hoped for, its story is full of lessons for any business trying to innovate and compete in tech.
So as you, our listener, think about this Zune story, think about these same principles, understanding consumers, branding, ecosystems, timing. How do these apply to what's happening in tech today? It's a reminder that lots of products have failed for different reasons. And the Zune story, as Molly tells it, is a really good one to learn from. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening.